It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
"Give me the keys," Arthur Vane snapped, his voice echoing through the vaulted marble foyer of the Vane estate. He didn't wait for her to respond, his hand already outstretched, palm up, demanding the fob to the modest electric car parked among the Ferraris and Bentleys of their gala guests. "You don't look like you belong in a vehicle like that anyway. It's an eyesore on the family brand." Julianna Vane felt the weight of a dozen stares from the socialites hovering near the coat check. She didn't flinch. She simply reached into the pocket of her bespoke, unbranded silk trousers and produced the sleek black remote. The silence in the room was heavy, punctured only by the distant, rhythmic clinking of silverware from the dining hall, where the pre-gala dinner was being served. "The car is registered in my name, Father," she said, her voice a calm contrast to his jagged edges. He let out a sharp, barking laugh that drew even more attention. He stood tall in his crested blazer, the gold embroidery catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "Everything in your name was put there by my grace, Julianna, and today my grace has run dry." He snatched the keys from her palm, his fingers cold and dry. He turned to the crowd, raising the fob like a trophy. "My daughter seems to think that playing at middle class is a charming hobby, but tonight we return to reality." Beatrice Vane drifted over then, the cloying scent of lilies following her like a funeral shroud. She placed a manicured hand on her husband's arm, her eyes never meeting her daughter's. "Now, Arthur, don't be cruel. She just doesn't understand the optics required for someone of our stature." She turned her gaze to Julianna, her smile thin and brittle. "Go upstairs and change, dear. That plain gray silk makes you look like the help. We have Governor Sterling arriving in 20 minutes, and I won't have him thinking we've hit hard times." "I'm not staying for the gala," she replied. A snicker came from the stairs. Leo Vane descended slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with an air of practiced boredom. "Of course she isn't staying. Didn't you tell her yet, Dad? Or were you waiting for the toast?" Arthur smirked, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. He stepped closer, leaning in so the guests could hear every word of his dismissal. "Leo is right. There's no seat for you at the table tonight, Julianna. In fact, there's no seat for you in this family anymore. I've signed the papers. You've been removed from the Vane Trust, effective immediately. No more stipend, no more access to the holding company, and certainly no more using our name to bolster your little real estate projects." The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Julianna felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She looked at her brother, who was grinning like he'd just won a race he hadn't even run. She looked at her mother, who was busy smoothing a wrinkle in Arthur's lapel. "You're disinheriting me, here in front of everyone?" she asked. "Public failures require public corrections," her father replied, his voice booming. He took a glass of vintage champagne from a passing waiter, the condensation on the crystal shimmering. He didn't offer her one. Instead, he held it up in a mock salute. "To Leo, the sole heir to the Vane legacy, a man who actually understands the value of a name." The guests began to murmur, some with pity, most with the shark-like hunger of people witnessing a social execution. Julianna felt the vibration of her phone in her pocket. It was a rhythmic pulse, 3 short bursts, the signal from Marcus Thorne. The final acquisition was complete. The Vane estate's primary holding company, the very foundation of her father's wealth, had just been swallowed by a private equity firm he couldn't even name. A firm she owned. She reached out and took the champagne glass from her father's hand. He let go, too surprised by her boldness to stop her. She didn't drink. She simply held it, watching the bubbles rise. "You're right about one thing, Father," she said, her voice dropping to a level that forced him to lean in. "Optics are everything." She tipped the glass slowly. The pale gold liquid poured over the toe of his hand-burnished Italian leather shoes, soaking into the expensive hide. Arthur recoiled, a hiss of rage escaping his teeth. "You ungrateful! I'll find my own way home," she interrupted, her expression as unreadable as stone. "Keep the car. You're going to need something to sell when the bank calls tomorrow morning." "Get out," he roared, his face turning a mottled purple that clashed with his silk tie. "Leave this house. You have nothing, do you hear me? Without me, you are a nobody." Julianna turned her back on him. She walked toward the massive oak doors, her heels clicking a steady, unwavering rhythm against the marble. She could feel the heat of their judgment on her spine, the whispers of the elite as they tore her reputation to shreds. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the smell of damp earth and expensive mulch filling her lungs, she pulled her phone from her pocket. She didn't look back at the glowing windows of the mansion or the life she was leaving behind. She swiped the screen and hit the speed dial. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady as she watched a black sedan pull up to the gates, not her modest electric car, but a vehicle far more powerful. "It's done. He just signed his own eviction notice. Execute the buyback, all of it. I want the locks changed by sunrise." She climbed into the back of the sedan, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that silenced the world. As the car pulled away, she looked at the invitation in her hand, the red ink of the Vane crest looking like a fresh wound. She crumpled it into a ball and dropped it onto the floor mat. The countdown had begun. Her father thought he had just stripped her of her future, but he had no idea he had just handed her the keys to his kingdom. She had 24 hours to prepare for the governor's dinner, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't going as a guest. She was going as the owner. The following morning, the sun bled through the smog of the city, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked pavement outside the bistro. Julianna Vane sat in a corner booth of the quiet cafe, the scent of burnt espresso and old newsprint grounding her. She wasn't hiding, she was waiting. Her fingers traced the cool, sleek edge of her tablet, where a private server displayed a live feed of the Vane Holdings debt restructuring. It was a sea of red ink that she was slowly, methodically turning into her own private ledger. Leo Vane appeared 10 minutes later. His arrival was heralded by the heavy, cloying scent of expensive sandalwood cologne that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the small room. He didn't sit. He stood over her, his bespoke navy blazer and crested buttons shimmering with an unearned luster. He looked at the vinyl seat of the booth with visible revulsion before tossing a thick leather folder onto the table. It hit her saucer, sending a splash of lukewarm coffee across her white silk cuff. "Sign it," he commanded. His voice had that peculiar, high-pitched edge of a man who mistook volume for authority. "Father realized he left the secondary deeds for the coastal development in your name. A clerical oversight he's eager to correct before the governor arrives tonight." Julianna didn't move to wipe the stain. She didn't even look at the folder. She kept her gaze on the tablet, watching a line of code execute. "The coastal development is a liability, Leo. The environmental permits are tied up in litigation. Why would Arthur want it now?" Leo laughed, a sharp, grating sound that made the elderly man at the next table flinch. He leaned down, his knuckles white as he pressed them into the laminate tabletop. "It's not about the permits, you dull girl. It's about the optics. We're announcing the expansion tonight at dinner. You're a Vane in name only now, and Father wants the books clean. You're a loose end, Julianna. One we're finally tying off." He reached out, flicking a stray crumb off her shoulder with a sneer. "Beatrice already had the staff move your things into the gardener's cottage at the edge of the estate. It's more suited to your current contributions. Consider it a mercy. You wouldn't want to be in the main house when the real players arrive." Julianna felt a flare of heat behind her ribs, the familiar, stoked fire of a lifetime of being underestimated. She reached into her bag, her hand brushing against the heavy, cold weight of a digital recorder. She didn't pull it out. Instead, she slid her phone an inch to the left, the screen dark but the microphone active. "The governor's dinner is at 8, she said, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Are you sure you want to spend your morning harassing the help? I'd imagine you have a lot of rehearsing to do. Father's speeches don't memorize themselves." Leo's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He snatched the folder back, his eyes narrowing. "Keep your snark, Jules. It's all you'll have left by midnight. Just remember, when you see us on that stage with Governor Sterling, you stay in the shadows where you belong. If I see you near the ballroom, I'll have security toss you over the gate myself." He turned on his heel, the bell above the door chiming with a mocking cheerfulness as he stepped back out into the bright morning. Juliana watched him go, her expression unreadable. She picked up her phone and tapped the screen. The recording was crystal clear. A moment later, the phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Thorne appeared, buyback at 52%. The bank just triggered the margin call on Leo's personal accounts. He's leveraged to the hilt, Juliana. He doesn't know the floor is already gone. Juliana leaned back, the vinyl of the booth creaking beneath her. She looked at the brown stain on her silk cuff. It was a small price to pay. She checked the time. 10 hours until the dinner. 10 hours until the Vane legacy, so carefully guarded by men who didn't understand its true cost, crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. She typed a short reply to Marcus. Ensure the governor's security detail receives the updated guest list. I want my name at the top. And Marcus, make sure the press has a clear view of the podium. She stood up, leaving a stack of bills on the table that far exceeded the cost of her coffee. As she walked out into the sunlight, she wasn't thinking about the cottage or the insults. She was thinking about the look on Leo's face when he realized that the loose end was actually the noose. 2 hours after leaving the diner, Julianna Vane stood in the hushed, mahogany-lined sanctuary of a private office that smelled of aged cedar and expensive ink. The city's glass towers cast long, predatory shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the air was still and cold. Marcus Thorne didn't look up from the heavy cream-colored folder on his desk until she was standing directly in front of him. He slid a single, yellow document across the polished surface. The 1954 deed of trust, he said, his voice a low rasp. Signed by your grandfather, witnessed by the original board, and never legally superseded. Arthur thinks the 1998 amendment gave him total control, but he forgot one crucial clause in the original bylaws. The bloodline succession isn't based on the eldest male. It's based on the primary investor. Juliana felt the heavy weight of the vellum as she picked it up. The paper was thick, almost like skin, and the ink of her grandfather's signature was still sharp after all these decades. This was it. The weapon she had spent 3 years sharpening in the dark. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the death warrant for her father's ego. She tucked the folder into her bag, her fingers brushing the smooth silk lining. "And the governor?" she asked. Marcus leaned back, a thin, dangerous smile touching his lips. "Governor Sterling is confirmed. He's expecting a private briefing on the new development project before the main toast. He has no idea that the man hosting him doesn't actually own the land the project sits on." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp, intrusive vibration. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. She answered anyway, keeping her voice as flat as a frozen lake. "Juliana," Arthur Vane barked without greeting. "I've sent a stylist to your apartment. Beatrice says your current wardrobe is insufficient for a guest of the governor's stature. Do not argue, just wear what they give you. And for God's sake, try to look like a Vane, not a librarian." "I'll be there, father," she said, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the darkened glass. "I wouldn't miss tonight for anything." "See that you don't. Leo Vane is already at the club with the advance team. He's handled the champagne selection and the seating chart. Try to stay out of his way. He's had a stressful week with the markets." Juliana nearly laughed. Stressful was an understatement. Her brother was currently underwater by 8 figures, a fact their father was blissfully unaware of as he preened for his high-status guests. Arthur hung up before she could respond, the dial tone a hollow hum in her ear. He didn't care about her words. He only cared about her presence as a decorative background piece to his supposed triumph. By the time Julianna Vane arrived at the Vane estate an hour later, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax. The mansion was a monument to inherited arrogance, crested tapestries, heavy silver, and portraits of men who looked exactly like Arthur. She found him in the library, adjusting a crested silk blazer in front of a gilded mirror. He looked every bit the patriarch, though the frantic way he straightened his tie betrayed his inner desperation. "There you are," he said, not bothering to turn around. "The stylist called. She said you refused the Dior gown." "It didn't fit the occasion," she replied, her voice calm. She watched him through the mirror. He looked powerful, but she could see the fraying edges of his legacy in the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a crystal glass of scotch. It didn't fit. It was a $10,000 dress. But then you've always lacked an eye for value. Arthur Vane took a sharp, bitter sip of the scotch, the ice clinking against the glass like a warning bell. Leo has been working himself to the bone to ensure this merger goes through. The least you could do is show some respect for the family name by looking the part. This tonight. This is about the Vane future, something you clearly don't understand. Oh, I understand the future perfectly, she said, stepping closer. She could smell the peat of his drink and the cloying, expensive cologne he wore to mask the scent of old age and anxiety. In fact, I think tonight will be the most honest representation of the Vane legacy we've seen in years. He finally turned, his eyes narrowing with a flash of entitled irritation. Don't be cryptic. It's a bore. Just be ready by 7. The governor arrives at 7:30, and I want the house perfect. If you can't be useful, at least be silent. He brushed past her, his shoulder catching hers in a deliberate show of dominance. She didn't flinch. She simply reached into her bag and felt the crisp edge of the 1954 deed. The countdown had begun. In less than 6 hours, the governor would be standing in the ballroom, the press would have their cameras ready, and the man who treated her like a servant would finally realize he was a tenant in his own home. She walked toward the grand staircase, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer echoing through the silent house. Each second was a heartbeat, bringing the end of an era closer. She had the evidence. She had the ally. Now all she needed was the audience. 24 hours before Governor Sterling was due to arrive, the Vane estate felt less like a home and more like a stage being dressed for a tragedy. Julianna Vane stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold, wrought-iron railing as she watched the frantic ballet below. Florists were hauling in massive urns of white lilies, their scent so cloyingly sweet it felt like a funeral. Arthur Vane stood in the center of the foyer, barking orders at a pair of trembling decorators. He looked every bit the patriarch in his crested navy blazer, his silver hair swept back with practiced precision. To the world, he was the king of this castle. To Julianna, he was a squatter who had forgotten whose name was actually on the deed. "Julianna," he shouted, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "Don't just stand there like a statue. Go check the vintage in the cellar. I won't have the governor served anything less than the 45. And for heaven's sake, do something about your hair. You look like a librarian, not a Vane." She descended the stairs, her movements fluid and disturbingly calm. "The cellar is already organized, Father. Everything is exactly where it belongs. Though I find it interesting how much effort you put into the polish when the foundations are so brittle." Arthur laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that didn't reach his eyes. "The foundations of this family are granite, girl. Decades of legacy. Something you'd understand if you spent less time with your nose in spreadsheets and more time learning how to command a room." The first rage spike hit her as Leo Vane wandered in, nursing a crystal glass of scotch despite it being barely noon. He smirked at her, leaning against a Louis XIV side table that Julianna knew for a fact was worth more than his entire annual allowance. "Leave her alone, Dad," Leo said, his voice thick with unearned confidence. "She's the help today. Someone else got to make sure the staff doesn't steal the silver. By the way, Jules, I had the valet move your little electric car to the service lot. It was an eyesore next to the Bentley. Try to remember your place today, okay?" Julianna felt the familiar prick of her nails digging into her palms, but she didn't lose her smile. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing the rough, ancient parchment of the 1954 deed. It was a secret weight, a silent power that made the air around her feel charged. "My place," Julianna said, her voice dropping to a level that made Beatrice Vane pause in her task of arranging place cards. "It's funny you mention that, Leo. Places have a way of shifting when the light changes. You should be careful with that scotch. It would be a shame to be intoxicated when the floor falls out from under you." Beatrice looked up, her brow furrowed in a rare moment of genuine observation. She saw the way Julianna stood, shoulders back, chin level, eyes devoid of the usual quiet compliance. For a second, the enabler's mask slipped, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Julianna, dear, you're being cryptic," Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just a dinner, a very important dinner." "It's more than a dinner, Mother. It's a closing," Julianna replied. She turned her gaze back to Arthur. "Father, a word of advice before tomorrow. When the governor asks about the history of this house, be very specific about the lineage. Lies have a way of curdling in the presence of the truth." Arthur waved her off with a flick of his wrist. "Enough of your riddles. Go, be useful or be gone." She didn't argue. She walked toward the library, the scent of floor wax and expensive perfume trailing behind her. Inside, Marcus Thorne was waiting, a sleek leather briefcase resting on the mahogany desk. He looked up as she entered, his sharp eyes taking in her steady hands. "The governor's office confirmed," Marcus whispered, his voice a low rasp. "He's bringing the press corps for the historical preservation announcement. He thinks he's honoring Arthur's legacy." "He's honoring a legacy, all right," Julianna said, looking out the window at the sprawling lawn she now knew belonged to her and her alone. "Just not the one my father thinks." She picked up a heavy silver letter opener, feeling its cold weight. The countdown was no longer in days or hours, but in heartbeats. Every frantic instruction Arthur shouted from the hall was a nail in a coffin he didn't even know was being built. "Is everything ready?" she asked. Marcus nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "The originals are in the safe. The digital copies are queued. All we need is the audience." Julianna looked back at the door. Tomorrow, the Vane name would mean something entirely different. She walked to the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the estate into a deep, final shadow. The house was quiet now, the calm before the storm. She could wait one more night. She had waited a lifetime already. The evening of the Vane Centennial Gala arrived with a stifling humidity that even the estate's industrial-sized cooling units couldn't fully suppress. Within the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of imported gardenias and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive hairspray. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting a wavering light over the polished marble floors that vibrated faintly with the rhythmic drone of a string quartet. Julianna Vane stood before her vanity, smoothing the front of her dress. It was a simple sheath of charcoal silk, bespoke but devoid of any visible branding. To the untrained eye, it was merely a well-cut garment. To those who knew the weight of the fabric, it was a statement of quiet, untouchable wealth. She adjusted a single strand of pearls, her grandmother's, and felt the cool, familiar weight against her collarbone. Her reflection showed a woman who looked like an afterthought in a house built on ego, which was exactly the mask she needed for the next few hours. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the door preceded her father's entrance. Arthur Vane stepped into the room, already dressed in a navy blazer adorned with the family's gold-crested buttons. He smelled of aged Scotch and arrogance. He didn't look at her face, only at her attire, his lip curling in a familiar, reflexive sneer. "You're actually wearing that?" he asked, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Tonight is about legacy, Julianna. You look like a librarian who wandered into a palace." "People will think I've hit a rough patch if my own daughter can't bother to find a sequin." "I prefer to be comfortable, father," she replied, her voice a level, calm pond. He scoffed, checking his gold Rolex for the third time in a minute. "Comfort is for the middle class. Tonight, we show the world that the Vane name is synonymous with power. I've relegated your seating to the far left of the dais. You're essentially staff-adjacent tonight. Try not to speak unless Governor Sterling addresses you directly. We can't have you rambling about market analytics when there are real deals being made." He turned on his heel without waiting for a response, the heavy scent of his cologne lingering like a bad memory. Julianna didn't flinch. She simply reached into her small clutch and felt the jagged edge of the encrypted flash drive Marcus had delivered an hour ago. It was a small, cold piece of plastic that held the power to incinerate the very legacy Arthur was so desperate to flaunt. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom was a sea of crested blazers and vintage champagne. Beatrice Vane moved through the crowd like a master conductor, her smile fixed and brittle as she managed the social optics of the room. She paused only to adjust the silk pocket square on Leo's tuxedo, whispering instructions into her son's ear while he scanned the room for the next tray of hors d'oeuvres. Leo Vane looked every bit the golden child, though the vacant shimmer in his eyes betrayed his incompetence. When he spotted his sister near the buffet, he sauntered over, a half-empty glass of crystal in his hand. "Nice car, Jules," he chuckled, leaning in close enough for her to smell the champagne on his breath. "I saw that little electric thing parked near the service entrance. The valet thought it belonged to the florist. I told him he wasn't far off." "It gets me where I need to go, Leo," she said, her expression unreadable. "Well, try not to get in the way of the governor," Leo said, patting her shoulder with a condescending heaviness. "Father's about to announce the new development board. My name is at the top of the list. Yours, predictably, isn't on it at all. Maybe you can take up knitting. I hear it's very therapeutic for the overlooked." He laughed, a loud, entitled sound that drew a few curious glances from nearby guests, before disappearing back into the throng of sycophants. Julianna watched him go, her gaze drifting toward the far corner of the room where Marcus Thorne stood. He was deep in conversation with a group of city auditors, but he caught her eye for a fraction of a second. A single, sharp nod was all the confirmation she needed. The digital copies were cued. The trap was set. The atmosphere shifted as Governor Sterling entered the hall. The quartet transitioned into a more regal arrangement, and the hum of conversation rose to a fever pitch. Arthur was there instantly, his hand extended, his posture radiating a performative humility that fooled no one who truly knew him. "Governor, a pleasure," Arthur's voice boomed, carrying across the marble. "I trust you've seen the models for the Vane Plaza. It's going to redefine the skyline. My son, Leo, has been the architect of the entire financial strategy." The governor offered a polite, practiced smile, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Julianna. He began to move toward her, but Arthur subtly stepped into his path, steering him toward a display of architectural renderings. "Julianna is just here for the family photos, Governor," Arthur said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "She's more of a silent partner in the family's domestic affairs. Now about that zoning permit." Julianna stood perfectly still, a glass of mineral water in her hand. She watched her father weave a tapestry of lies, each word a thread that would eventually choke him. She felt a strange, detached sort of pity, but it was quickly eclipsed by the memory of every board meeting where he'd muted her microphone, every contract he'd signed in her name without her consent, and every time he'd called her disposable. She walked toward the technical booth at the back of the hall, her heels clicking softly on the marble, a steady, deliberate countdown. The technician, a young man Marcus had vetted extensively, looked up as she approached. "Is the feed synchronized?" she whispered. "Ready on your signal, Miss Vane," he replied, his fingers hovering over the console. "Everything is routed through the main projector. Once it starts, they won't be able to kill the power without shutting down the entire estate's grid." "Good," she said. She turned back to the room. Arthur was now stepping up to the mahogany podium, the Vane crest gleaming behind him. He tapped the microphone, the sharp feedback silencing the room. He looked out over the sea of wealth and influence, his chest swelling with the misplaced pride of a man who thought he had won. Julianna moved to the edge of the dais, standing in the shadows just outside the main spotlight. She saw Beatrice adjust her pearls. She saw Leo puff out his chest. She saw Marcus move toward the emergency exits, ensuring the security team stayed in place. Arthur cleared his throat, a wide, predatory smile stretching across his face. "Friends, colleagues, Governor Sterling, tonight we don't just celebrate 100 years of the Vane name. We celebrate the future. A future built on integrity, strength, and the unwavering leadership of the next generation." He looked directly at Leo, then back at the crowd. Julianna reached into her clutch one last time, her thumb pressing the small button on the remote. The projector hummed, a low, predatory growl that signaled the end of the world as Arthur Vane knew it. "I have a presentation," Arthur announced, gesturing grandly to the screen behind him. A vision of what's to come. Juliana leaned against a cold marble pillar, her heart beating with a calm, rhythmic precision. "Yes, father," she murmured to the empty air beside her. "A vision of exactly what's to come." Arthur Vane stood at the podium, his chest puffed out like a peacock. The projector hummed, casting a blue glow over the silent, expectant crowd. Governor Sterling sat in the front row, his arms crossed, his presence lending a heavy, judicial weight to the evening. Julianna Vane stood by a cold marble pillar, her thumb resting on the plastic of the remote hidden in her clutch. "The Vane legacy is one of expansion," Arthur announced, his voice booming through the ballroom, rich with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. He clicked his remote, expecting to see the architectural renderings of the new Vane Plaza. Instead, the screen flickered to life with a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer. Then another. Then a spreadsheet titled Offshore Diversion Private Account. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Arthur clicked the remote again, his movements becoming frantic. "There seems to be a glitch," he stammered. But the next slide was worse. A forged signature, his own handwriting unmistakable, authorizing the liquidation of the family's charitable trust. The transformation was visceral. Arthur's face, usually a mask of bronze-tanned arrogance, curdled into a sickly, translucent gray. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted frantically between the towering screen and the stone-faced board members. A bead of sweat traced a jagged path through his foundation, while his lower lip developed a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that made his manicured jaw look fragile. The confidence that had defined him for 60 years evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, panting man who looked suddenly, pathetically small. Governor Sterling stood up slowly. He didn't say a word, but the way he pulled his blazer tight and stepped away from the Vane family table spoke volumes. It was a physical excommunication. Beatrice Vane let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying to her throat as her champagne flute slipped from her fingers. The crystals shattered against the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. Leo Vane stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open, his face pale as he realized the inheritance he'd been bragging about was a hollowed-out shell. Juliana stepped out from the shadows of the pillar. Her heels clicked with a steady, predatory rhythm as she approached the podium. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at the man who had spent a lifetime dismissing her. "The projector isn't broken, Arthur," she said, her voice low and terrifyingly calm. It carried through the silent hall without the need for a microphone. "The data is just finally catching up with the lies." He reached for the edge of the podium, his knuckles white and shaking. "Juliana, what is this? This is a fabrication. A stunt." "It's an audit," she corrected. She looked toward Marcus Thorne, who was already stepping forward with a leather-bound folder. He handed a copy to the governor and another to the head of the board. "Every cent you took from the employees' pension fund to cover your losses in Macau is documented there. Every forged signature, every lie told to the board." She leaned in closer, the scent of her modest, clean soap a sharp contrast to his heavy, musk-laden panic. "You told me I didn't belong in this family because I didn't have the killer instinct. You were wrong. I just have a better memory." Arthur tried to speak, but only a wet, wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but even Beatrice had turned her head away, unable to look at the evidence of his thievery. The board members were already huddled, their faces grim as they looked at the documents Marcus had provided. "Governor," Juliana said, nodding to the man who represented the very status her father craved. "I apologize for the interruption to your evening. The authorities are waiting in the foyer to discuss the Vane Plaza contracts." She turned her back on him then, not waiting for a response, not staying to watch him scramble for an explanation that didn't exist. She caught Marcus's eye, a brief, silent flash of victory passing between them. "We're done here," she whispered. As she walked toward the grand exit, the room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and accusations behind her. She didn't look back. She could already feel the cool night air waiting for her outside, And for the first time in her life, the Vane name didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a trophy. Arthur Vane stood frozen at the center of the ballroom, the sound of his own name being called by the uniformed officers in the foyer echoing like a death knell. The silence that followed Julianna's exit was heavy, thick with the scent of wilting lilies and expensive, stale champagne. For a moment, the patriarch looked as though he might simply command the reality to change through sheer force of will. Then, the mottled purple of rage began to creep up his neck, clashing violently with his silk tie. "This is a fabrication," Arthur roared, his voice cracking under the weight of the sudden, suffocating attention. He turned toward the board members, his hands gesticulating wildly toward the frozen projector screen. "Julianna has always had a flair for the dramatic. It's a pathetic, vengeful attempt at a power grab by a daughter who couldn't cut it in the real world. Governor, surely you see through this." Governor Sterling didn't move to offer a hand. Instead, he took a deliberate step back, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. He looked at Arthur not as a long-time associate, but as a sudden, dangerous liability. "The Vane Plaza contracts were signed under my administration, Arthur," the governor said, his voice clipped and devoid of its usual warmth. "If there is even a hint of racketeering or document forging, I cannot be seen within a mile of this house. My office will be conducting its own inquiry." The shift in the room was visceral. It was the sound of high society allegiances snapping like dry twigs. Beatrice Vane reached for her husband's arm, but her eyes were already darting toward the side exits, her mind clearly calculating the social cost of remaining by his side. She looked at the screen, then at the foyer where the authorities waited, and slowly withdrew her hand. The enabler was finally looking for her own escape hatch. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the buffet line, his leather briefcase clicking open with a sound like a pistol cocking. He didn't look at Arthur. He walked straight to the lead investigator who had just entered the room, handing him a slim, silver tablet. "The digital ledger is synced, detective," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence. "The offshore accounts were masked using the Vane family trust, but the signatures are biometric. There is no clerical error, and there is no scapegoat. The trail leads directly to the chairman's private office." The color drained from Arthur's face with terrifying speed. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was a total collapse of his composure. His skin took on the gray, translucent quality of wet parchment, and the skin beneath his eyes sagged as if the very muscles in his face had given up. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling almost imperceptibly as he tried to find words that wouldn't come. The arrogance that had served as his armor for 40 years slewed off, revealing a terrified, aging man who realized the walls were not just closing in, they were falling. His breathing became shallow and jagged, a frantic, wheezing sound that made the guests nearest to him shift their chairs away in a synchronized wave of rejection. "Leo, do something," Arthur hissed, his eyes darting toward his son. Leo Vane was staring at his phone, his face a mask of pale horror. He looked up, his voice trembling with a cowardice that was inherited. I didn't know about the Plaza accounts, Dad. You told me the signatures were just a formality. You said it was all legal." The golden child, the boy Arthur had spent a lifetime grooming to replace Julianna, was already cutting the cord. Leo took a step toward Marcus, his hands raised as if in surrender. "I'm happy to cooperate. I have the login logs for the firm's server." Arthur's knees buckled slightly. He reached out to steady himself on the mahogany table, but his hand slipped on a spilled drop of wine, and he nearly fell. The board members, men who had laughed at his jokes and toasted his success for decades, were now huddled in a tight circle, their backs literally turned to him. One of them, a senior director who had known Arthur since university, was already on a hushed call with a crisis management firm. "You ungrateful, treacherous." Arthur began, his gaze finding Julianna as she lingered for one last moment in the doorway to the foyer. He tried to lung toward her, but the officers were faster. Two of them stepped into his path, their presence a solid wall of blue and black. "I gave you everything. The Vane name, this life, the very clothes on your back." Julianna stood perfectly still, the cool night air from the open foyer doors ruffling the hem of her unbranded silk dress. She looked at the man who had tried to bury her talent under a mountain of tradition and ego. "You gave me a cage, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through his frantic shouting. "And you used my mother's legacy to bar the door. I didn't take your company. I simply reclaimed what you stole from the estate 5 years ago. The Vane name doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the creditors." The lead investigator placed a heavy, firm hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Arthur Vane, you're coming with us for questioning regarding the Vane Plaza contracts and suspected embezzlement." Arthur fumbled with his pocket, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his heavy brass key ring. It hit the marble with a discordant, lonely chime. No one moved to pick it up. He looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face, a single ally, but he found only the cold, judgmental stares of the people he had spent his life trying to impress. Julianna watched him for a heartbeat, her expression unreadable. She felt no surge of petty joy, only a profound sense of equilibrium. The weight was gone. She turned her back on the chaos, walking out into the quiet dark of the driveway. Behind her, the dynasty wasn't just crumbling, it was being hauled away in the back of a black sedan. She reached her car and paused, looking at the darkened windows of the Vane estate. Tomorrow, the locks would be changed. Tomorrow, the board would vote. But tonight, for the first time in her life, the silence was finally hers. 6 months later, the glass-walled corner office of the new headquarters smelled of fresh rain and expensive leather, a sharp departure from the stale cigar smoke that had once defined her father's reign. Julianna Vane stood by the window, watching the city pulse below. The skyline looked different when you weren't constantly looking for cracks in the foundation. She smoothed the front of her unbranded charcoal silk blazer, feeling the cool, heavy weight of the fabric. It was a quiet armor for a quiet life, one she had finally earned. A soft chime echoed through the room. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thick, slate-gray carpet. He carried a single manila folder, his expression mirroring the same professional calm he had maintained throughout the chaotic transition. He didn't need to speak for her to know the finality of the documents inside. "The liquidation of the upstate estate is complete," he said, his voice steady. He set the folder on her desk, near a crystal carafe beaded with cold condensation. "The creditors have been satisfied. What remains of the personal trust has been moved to the court-mandated accounts." She didn't open the folder immediately. She already knew the numbers. "And my father. Arthur Vane is officially moved into the 2-bedroom rental in the West End," he replied. "It's a respectable building, though I understand he spent the morning complaining to the super about the lack of a doorman. He tried to use his old title to demand a corner unit, but the management was quite firm. They've heard the news, Julianna. Everyone has." She felt a flicker of the old tension in her chest, but it passed quickly, replaced by a dull, clinical observation. It was the irony that bit the hardest. Arthur Vane, a man who had built a career on the exclusivity of zip codes, was now living in a neighborhood he used to refer to as the waiting room for the middle class. The office door opened again, but this time there was no polite chime. Beatrice Vane entered with the frantic, rustling energy of a bird trapped in a room. She was wearing a wool coat that was 3 seasons old, the edges of the cuffs beginning to fray, a subtle, painful marker of how far the family's social currency had devalued. She didn't look at Marcus. Her eyes were fixed on her daughter with a mixture of desperation and a lingering, misplaced sense of authority. "You have to do something, Julianna," her mother began, her voice trembling. The scent of her floral perfume, once a symbol of elegance, now felt cloying and desperate in the sterile office air. "Your brother is in a state. Leo Vane hasn't left his apartment in weeks. He says he's depressed, and the bills for his wellness retreat are mounting. And your father, he sent me this." She thrust a crumpled piece of paper onto the desk. It was a letter written on the old Vane Acquisitions stationery, the logo she had legally retired months ago. Julianna glanced at the elegant script. Her father was demanding a consultancy fee for his years of institutional wisdom. claiming that the company's current success was merely the momentum he had created. The audacity was almost impressive. Even in the wreckage of his reputation, he still believed the world owed him a seat at the head of the table. "He needs legal defense funds, Juliana," Beatrice continued, her voice rising. "You're the CEO now. You have the resources. It's selfish to watch your own blood drown while you sit up here in the clouds. We are family. That used to mean something." Juliana looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw the cost of the last 6 months. The cost wasn't the money or the estate. It was the realization that the woman standing before her would never see her as anything more than a resource to be mined. There was no apology for the years of dismissiveness, no recognition of the theft they had all ignored. There was only the demand. "I've already paid for the West End rental for the next year," Juliana said, her voice like a sheet of ice. "And Leo has been offered 3 different entry-level positions at firms Marcus vetted. He turned them all down because they didn't come with an executive title. I am not funding a retreat for a man who refuses to work, and I am certainly not paying for a legal defense against the very evidence I provided to the board." "You're cold," Beatrice whispered, the word hitting the quiet room like a slap. "You've become just like him." "No," Juliana replied, standing up and walking around the desk. She felt the smooth, solid grain of the wood under her palm, a foundation she had built, not inherited. "He took things that didn't belong to him. I simply took back what was mine. There's a difference." She walked her mother to the door, the click of her heels on the hardwood transition sounding with a final, rhythmic authority. As the door closed, the silence returned, but it wasn't the lonely silence of the Vane estate. It was the quiet of a house that had finally stopped shaking. She returned to the window. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the city. Governor Sterling was hosting a gala tonight, an event her father would have killed to attend. Juliana had declined the invitation. She didn't need the witnesses anymore. She didn't need the validation of the old guard. She picked up the gold fountain pen on her desk and signed the final rebranding decree. The name Vane was gone from the letterhead, replaced by a simple, elegant monogram. The past was a debt she had finally settled in full. She looked out at the horizon, realizing that for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was the one who decided where the feet would land.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.